The wild sound of flopping and tumbling filled the air, as three bodies rolled down the stairs together, toppling from step to step as a knot of mingled limbs, miserably failing to catch themselves for a few meters, before feline instincts finally kicked in successfully, allowing all three men to quickly untangle themselves, as they rolled off each other in a smooth motion, using the already present downwards momentum. Esfatara groaned slightly, feeling every single muscle in his back that he had bruised and pulled during the rough descent, while his ears were still heavily ringing from the earlier supersonic booms. However, even while he was still lamenting to himself, the feeling of a constant trickle of blood running right across his face for a moment reminded him that the pain in his back was still highly preferable to the alternative that he had sought to avoid with the knee-jerk reaction to throw himself and his soldiers down the stairs. Glancing back up for just a moment as he fought himself back onto his feet, he could still very clearly see the peppering of the above wall of the stairway that had been entirely torn apart by the human's projectiles. Though for now, the constant fire seemed to have subsided, likely because the attackers had heard the inelegant descent that the felines had managed to escape it. However, by no means had the earlier primal cry of a death threat left Esfatara's mind yet, and he knew if they wasted even a moment, the bullets would start hailing again. Therefore, he tore his eyes away from the way they had come from, and quickly reached down to pull his men, who seemed to have some more trouble getting up after the fall than he did, back to their feet with a firm grip on their arms. They groaned in pain, but he couldn't take that into account right now. Their lives were more valuable than their painlessness. "Go! Go!" he urged them, as he pushed against their shoulders, hurrying them forwards as he did his best to get them running. He couldn't really realize if they were replying anything or not, since his ears still sounded like someone was blowing an obnoxious whistle right next to them. All he could do was make sure they would keep going while he grit his teeth. They just had to run. They were faster. Though there was a sting in the back of his mind as the thought went through his head. They were faster, but somehow he hadn't been. He had been hit before he was even able to take the shot. One of the humans had pulled their trigger unimaginably fast. Despite the idea making sense, it couldn't have been his fellow feline on their side that had taken the shot, because the shot would have had to have been taken right at the moment when Esfatara had his eyes right on her, and her weapon had been down with her eyes nowhere near him. No, it had to have been one of the primates. The wound on his ear burned painfully as it twitched at the memory of the round ripping past him. Well, at least they didn't have time to aim properly. With the force those things were packing, it had probably barely grazed his ear to cause such minimal damage. Any closer, and he quite possibly wouldn't be running away from this at all. By now, luckily, everyone's brains and survival instincts had kicked back into action at full force, meaning most of the forces were tearing out of there like a horde of starved hogs was after them. And Esfatara would have done it just like them, had he not taken a moment to take stock if everyone truly got going, his eyes quickly counting heads of those already running, before gazing to the side to see how many still needed to pick up speed. His face fell flat as his eyes quickly got stuck to a rather disheartening picture. While everyone else had gotten to running, their minds likely filled with just as much of a haze from the sudden stress as Esfatara's own was. Two figures had entirely stayed behind. Amana lay slumped against the wall on a step near the bottom of the stairs. Despite forming the anchor for their advance, and therefore not taking the same tumble down the stairs that Esfatara and the two others had, it seemed like he had lost all control of himself, his limbs twitching wildly and uncontrolled, as all he seemed able to do was push himself against the wall with flaming steps that barely managed to stay on the ground long enough to push himself just a little bit. Maraksha stood leaned over him, doing his best to hold his friend down in an attempt to keep Amara still enough so he could try to assist him in any way, or at least assess the situation. Esfatara stood stunned for a moment, wondering if one of the bullets aimed at him had ricocheted in an unlikely way, and somehow managed to hit the man down the stairs. However, as Maraksha managed to calm his friend's erratic movements through gentle force, the truth of the matter became apparent. Hanging at his side, and completely torn out of his socket by the looks of it, was the cable that was meant to connect the little box on his hip that provided electric stimulation to his brain and muscles in order to allow him to move properly on his own. The hanging bits of wire and gilded covering that still stuck to one end of the cable, as well as the broken shell of the box itself, heavily indicated that there was no saving the thing, and without its aid, the muscles of his body had almost immediately begun to once again twitch and seize, with constant electrical misfires originating from his scrambled up brain. Miraksha has seemingly also taken notice of the damage, and he quickly inspected the destroyed box that must have somehow gotten caught up in the earlier tangle of limbs that came tumbling down the stairs just past the man. However, it seemed that he quickly came to the same assessment that the thing was well and truly fucked up, with no chance of a quick fix happening here. It seemed like he was trying to speak to Amana as well, but whatever he was saying, it was far too quiet for Esvatara to understand. And there was another thing that he most certainly couldn't hear, that his brain, however, vehemently tried to convince him was reaching his ears, from not very far away. Encroaching, running footsteps, hammering the ground in firm stomps of pure fury. And, well, even though he knew there was no way he was actually hearing those, that didn't mean that he necessarily denied their existence. They were on borrowed time here. Everything felt like it was taking ages. However, in reality, only just a few seconds had passed, ever since he took his tumble down the stairs. But those seconds were still precious few, because there was not a doubt in his mind that they would have to get out of it quickly if they didn't want to end up just as riddled with holes as the unlucky wall just upstairs was. However, how to do that now? After mulling it over for just a moment, his eyes darting from his men to up the stairs, back to his men, and then to their escape route a couple of times, Esvatara then quickly darted forwards to the two of them, pressing his hand firmly onto Miraksha's shoulder. "You've got to go," he urged the man quickly, before it would be too late, already trying to pull him away so he could push him into a sprint. However, Miraksha wasn't budging. "I'll take care of Amana. You've got to get out of here while you still can." He tried to pull a little harder. However, all that achieved was that Miraksha firmly yanked his shoulder out of his grasp. No way! I'm leaving you here!" Miraksha protested, with his face scrunching into a snarl, as he turned right back to assist Amana. Then his expression mellowed out a bit as his eyes fell onto his friend's pain-ridden face, as his limbs twitched violently. His eyes narrowing in contemplation for a moment, he swiftly jumped up to his feet and began fiddling with the device hanging from his own hip. Right as he had stood up, Esvatara was already on him again, grabbing the soldier by his shoulder and turning his face so they would have to look at each other. "Are you insane? You tried to get me to leave from the start," he said firmly, and stared into Miraksha's eyes intensely, his voice quivering slightly, as he tried so very hard to make it sound commanding. "Stop being stubborn and get the hell out of here! That is an order!" His face had darkened into an almost aggressive grimace, which was, however, almost immediately replaced by a wide-eyed look of bafflement, as his arms were swatted away in one quick motion, as Miraksha entirely disregarded his order, and turned right back to fiddling with his own box and wires. "Not happening!" he insisted, and shook his head slightly with his ears folded back, as he narrowed his eyes in intense focus, while forcing his hands to remain as still and unjittery as possible, while he quickly removed his own contacts and unstrapped the box from his belt. Though, of course, all that effort immediately became useless once he had succeeded in his task. Without the wires in place, his own muscles' movements began to deteriorate just as quickly as Amana's had earlier, even if they would never quite reach the same degree of invalidity. Stunned by the action, as it was the first time that Miraksha had ever outright refused one of his orders, despite their constant disagreements, Esvatara could only stare for a moment, his eyes darting from Miraksha to the direction of danger up the stairs, where the murderous primate could emerge at any second now. Meanwhile, Miraksha was leaning down to his friend, his hand struggling extremely with each movement as he attempted to connect his own undamaged device to Amana's body. Still, with his hands shaking like they were, the process appeared to be anything but easy. Releasing a frustrated hiss after a couple of hardly successful steps in the process, he finally tore his face around for a moment to bark up at Esvatara, his eyes filled with fearful irritation. Stop ogling and help me, he demanded loudly, his voice a mix of panic and pure stress, as it cut through the ringing in Espatara's ears. It was visible on his face that he felt himself, and more importantly his motions deteriorate more and more by the second, meaning his task would only get harder and harder the longer it would take, meaning it would take longer and become harder in a vicious circle. Still slightly stunned, and now only caring about getting those two out of here as quickly as possible by any means necessary, Espatara also crouched down, and, after a few quick instructions from Maraksha's side, his own much steadier hand had no problem quickly putting the contacts of the borrowed device into their proper places, or removing the ones from the busted version, despite the twitching body of the soldier almost seeming like it wanted to fight against him on that almost every step of the way. Meanwhile, Maraksha himself managed to keep his hands just still enough to turn up the output of the box that used to be his, as he generally needed much lower doses of juice than his much more messed up friend did. As soon as he had made the proper adjustments, and Espatara had connected the last few contacts, the effect was basically immediate. The violent twitching and thrashing stopped, and Amana's face quickly relaxed as he took a few quick yet deep breaths to presumably allow the pain to subside. Meanwhile, Maraksha seemed to be going through exactly the opposite of that process, though his face never quite reached the same expression of pain that Amana had been in earlier. Still, despite the fact that it seemed like he was already getting to the point where he had trouble standing up, Maraksha wrapped his trembling hands around Amana's arm as he started to pull him back to his feet, with limited success. Espatara, on the other hand, was much more successful, as he yanked the man to his feet in one decisive pull, immediately using the momentum of that same movement to push Amana into a running motion. "Now, move!" he yelled out imperiously, as Amana turned his head to look back at him and Maraksha for a moment, likely in an attempt to return the help he had gotten. However, Espatara was having none of it, snarling aggressively as he barked out his orders, without leaving even minuscule room for discussion on the matter. "Move your tail! Go, go, go!" Amana's eyes widened immediately, and unlike Maraksha, the man did not have any tendencies to push back against his commanding officer, established within himself, meaning before he even knew it, he was already running the other direction with his newly working legs. Then, Espatara quickly grabbed Maraksha, pulling the by now heavily shaking man along as he went to get out of here as well. And thank all that was good in the world, his friend was finally allowing him to actually do so without any resistance, doing his best to keep up on his weak legs as they got into motion. And not a millisecond too soon, it seemed, because Espatara could quite literally feel the draft of a bullet brush past the fur on the end of his tail, just as he pulled Maraksha out of the stairwell, with the crack of the shot following a fraction of a heartbeat later. "Damn it!" Espatara pressed out through his teeth, knowing that their time was up. They would have to run like they had never ran before if they wanted to make it out of here. They would have to outrun the marksman, because there was no outrunning those rounds. And with Maraksha in his current state, he could already feel that they were losing the race, even against such a slow opponent. And that was him being hopeful, and assuming that Shida wouldn't be coming after them as well. Maraksha was dragging his feet as they ran. Not on purpose. He clearly just couldn't get them to lift as fast as he wanted to, as Espatara pulled in him. The soldier released a frustrated sigh. Here, shit, he began to say, but Espatara immediately shook his head heavily. "Don't you dare finish that sentence," he ordered, his anxieties all bubbling to the surface along with that sentence. His brain kept screaming at him that they had to keep moving. However, he knew that if they did, they were already lost. They stood no chance here. Damn it! If only he hadn't tucked in his claws. He showed mercy one single time, and now they would pay dearly for it, held back by the very condition they had come here to avenge. There was no way that psychopath would return the favor. Not after what they had heard earlier. However, as those thoughts ran through his head, there was something else that came along with it. For the first time since his bullet had hit his ear, his panicked brain picked up on a sensation that had been there this whole time. The weight of his own weapon hanging from the sling around his body. Somehow, it had entirely slipped his mind for this entire chaos, disappearing from his thoughts as soon as he had missed the first shot. But now, his free hand slid along the sling, running it along the skin between his thumb and index finger, as he followed it to the weapon itself. The panic had really gotten to him, it seemed, and it had made him overlook the most obvious thing in the world. They couldn't run, yes, but that didn't mean that this was over yet. Before he was going down, he would give those freaks a taste of their own medicine. "When the hell did he get so strong?" Sheeta could hear Sam loudly wondering behind herself, as both she and Admir had been thrown off during an ultimately failed attempt to hold James back from chasing after the attackers. Sheeta's own mind was still buzzing from everything that had just happened, desperately racing to catch up with the events. First, the fire, then the extinguishing, then more, and then there was a shot. Actually, there were two. Sheeta had barely managed to catch a single glimpse of the figure that had suddenly come around a corner out of nowhere, when Coco had already pulled the trigger. The bullet had wounded the attacker, but that hadn't prevented them from taking fire as well. As soon as Sheeta had heard the shots, there had also been a painful yelp, and a moment later, Nia had crumbled to the ground, with the smell of blood hanging heavily in the air. But the feline didn't even have a moment to access any possible injuries of the woman, because basically as soon as it had happened, there was suddenly a new hail of gunfire, and her gaze snapped around to see James with his weapon raised, taking shot after shot at the wall that their attacker had disappeared behind just after firing. Hole after hole was torn into the wall, as James began to walk towards it slowly, his face contorted into something that could only be described with one single word. Wrath. Nothing else did it justice. None of its usual symptoms, and coming even close to the absolute all-consuming emotion that so clearly overwhelmed anything else within the man's body at that point. Sheeta had seen James incredibly angry before, but this was in a completely different realm. Shot after shot tore through the room as he seemed undeterred in pulling the trigger over and over, almost robotically so, as he stepped further towards the direction of the stairwell. However, soon enough there was a sudden crashing and the sound of heavy bodies falling. For a moment, Sheeta thought that one of the bullets must have found its mark and taken the attacker down. However, James seemed to have the exact opposite idea, as his dark eyes widened in even deeper fury, his steps immediately speeding up into a stiff sprint, with his boots heavily hitting the wet ground as he let out a guttural scream. "You're dead!" Despite the fact that it was most certainly not directed at her, even Sheeta felt that threat all the way down to her bones as the scream reverberated through her body, and it immediately stopped her from truly reacting to the situation for a moment too long. Not because she was afraid of James in any way, but simply because it was such a shock to her system to see him like this. Not that he didn't have every reason to be furious. No, she couldn't fault him for that. It was just the way that he expressed himself that went so entirely against his usual behavior. It seemed that the bubbling fuel within him had finally found its spark. Soon enough, the other two had broken away from the rest of the group to try and stop her snap boyfriend in his tracks. Most of them were busy falling down next to Nia to provide first aid to whatever injury she had actually suffered from the bullet. However, obviously somebody had to make sure James wouldn't get himself killed in his single-minded pursuit of revenge. "Don't be an idiot, James," Abner had sternly said after catching up to him, while he and Sam tried to grab him by the shoulder. However, despite a brief struggle ensuing, the effort had obviously been short-lived in the end. Still, seeing how James disregarded their worries and basically barged right through his friends without even a reaction as he threw them off, was what finally shook Sheeta out of her observing stupor, leading to her now sticking basically right to James's back as he was just about to reach the stairwell. Obviously she had no trouble at all catching up to the human. However, she wasn't quite sure what to do now. Just grab him and try to force him back like the other two did? Somehow, she didn't see that really working. She knew that James would never hurt her, so that wasn't something that she worried about. However, she also definitely didn't want to hurt him in an attempt to make him stop by any means necessary, and she was sure he definitely wouldn't stay put if she simply tried to hold on to him gently. He seemed to have entirely locked in onto a single action, and Sheeta couldn't even tell how much of the world around him he was still perceiving. Well, that was apart from the very thing he was focused on, because as soon as they had reached the stairs, she witnessed firsthand that he was still scarily effective at recognizing that, as she once again barely caught a glimpse of the figure just disappearing behind the next corner, while instantly shooting after them, the bullet hitting the wall right where they had just disappeared. Sheeta was both impressed and disturbed by this on one hand, but on the other hand, she did have to wonder why they were even still down there at all. After all, even though he had managed to free himself in relatively good time, James still had been stalled on his advance quite a bit. What then had held up the people she had just seen run from them for so long? It was suspicious, if nothing else, and so the urge to try and stop James in his pursuit gained some prominence within her mind. Although, she didn't get to ponder her approach for even a moment, because while she was still thinking how she would stop him from dashing down the stairs, James seemingly had done some quick mental maths, with his thirst for retribution reaching the conclusion that a dash was nowhere near fast enough. Leaning back to take a single step of startup, James quickly burst forward in a forceful movement, catapulting himself with a hefty jump. In the planet's low gravity, the human caught quite a bit of air as he sailed down about half of the flight of stairs. He landed heavily, letting out a deep grunt as his legs buckled slightly under the impact of his weight. However, it didn't even take a moment before he had already recovered and went right for the next leap, crossing the other half of the stairs all the way down. Once again, it took Sheeta a bit to process what was happening, and she almost couldn't believe that that person she was watching as he jumped down a flight of stairs because walking was too slow for him was the same person she had fallen asleep next to last night. Of course, she had seen him in a similar state before, but this time it felt just different. Or maybe she hadn't noticed it as much last time, because she had been laser focused on pulling her own head out of the sling back then. Either way, she quickly pulled herself out of her shock and hurried after him, though she decided to use the stairs the intended way as she dashed to catch up. By now, she was certain that she had to stop him somehow. Whether his lust for revenge was justified or not didn't matter right now. She had to make sure he was thinking clearly again before he would have to decide about that. However, that was much easier said than done. She would have to come up with something here, and fast. Surely she would be able to think of something. Still, her thinking had to be put on hold for a second, because as she sprinted down the last few steps, her eyes suddenly went wide as she saw a broad back suddenly recoil in her direction, causing her to avoid crashing right into James by a hair, as he took a few steps back all of a sudden. The sound of shots was muffled in his ears. So was the crashing and cracking as they buried into the wall right next to him after they had just missed their mark, leaving deep bursting holes behind. And so was the biting pain radiating from the wound that had been torn into his chest by one of the bullets. James stared at the holes and his wound impassively for a moment. There were just enough survival instincts still present and prevalent in his mind that he knew running right into a line of fire was a bad idea. Not necessarily because of the risk of being hurt further itself, but because of the risk of being incapacitated to a point where he couldn't keep going anymore. Though, as he noticed a movement in his periphery, he realized that Sheeta was just behind him again. With an instinctive sting in the back of his mind, he stretched out one of his arms to the side and took another step back, herding her a bit further out of harm's way, as more suppressing fire rained through the door like a torrent of death. He couldn't make it through there, not if they were awaiting him, but he had to, if he wanted to get to them. The screaming wrath in his gut bubbled up hotter and hotter as he wanted to keep up its pursuit, but was forced to temper itself in order to not get entirely extinguished. It aggravated him to no end, slowly mounting in fury as his one-track mind came to a screeching halt as the obstacle before him threatened to derail it. However, anger was a potent fuel, volatile but potent. And as it was forced to slow down for a moment, his brain gradually began to work. Not quite the parts that would usually hold him to care and reason, no. Those were still lying completely dormant. But those parts that he had used for his work for years of his life, those that logged direct, logical, natural connections between things, those were quick to wake up again. In a calculating motion, his eyes followed the direction the bullets were coming from over to the wall they were impacting into, his brain drawing a straight line between the 2 points. Then, he tilted his head down slightly, looking at the distance between that wall and himself, mentally drawing out the angle between those two lines. If that was around 60 degrees, then... Lifting the arm that held his weapon to form a third line that completed the triangle, James took blind aim at the wall next to him. If he didn't mistake the layout of this place, then there would have to be a room next to him now, meaning the bullet would have to pass through two walls before it could even possibly reach his mark. Would that work? Would it get stuck? He didn't know. However, he didn't care either. After all, there was one way to find out. To increase the chance of a hit should the bullets manage to penetrate, James didn't pull the trigger just once, instead once again peppering the flat surface with shots, watching impassively as the projectiles passed right through the thin metal covering it. It was quite handy, really, as the velvety fabric actually caught a good bit of debris that might have otherwise sprayed back at him, especially in his current sticky wet state. He couldn't really hear a whole lot after he stopped pulling the trigger. The constant assault of explosions on his ears certainly hadn't done his hearing any favours, meaning it was mostly filled by a constant ring right then. What he did notice, however, was the fact that the shots from his opposition had stopped. Had a shot connected? Was it a trick? Did they deem it too unsafe to continue the barrage? There was only one way to find out. Somewhere in the corner of his vision, he noticed Sheeta trying to tell him something. However, between the ringing titanus and the numb rush of his own heart beating into his ears, he couldn't hear a word she was saying. It didn't look like she was hurt, so whatever she was saying, it couldn't have been all that important. As he kept moving, Sheeta brushed up against his side for a moment. At first, his brain kicked into mild irritation, worrying that she might try to stop him. However, luckily, she didn't. A twinge of misplaced joy bubbled up along with the mixture of fire and brimstone that came from inside, as she simply brushed along his side for a moment, without offering any further resistance to his movement. He wasn't quite sure what it meant. However, the fire burning in his guts cheered to the fact that she let him move onward. Deep within his periphery, he saw her make some strange motions that he couldn't identify due to their scheme-like nature in the very corners of his vision. And as he kept walking, he could still hear the vague sounds of her voice as she seemingly kept talking. He still couldn't really understand it. But since she hadn't tried to stop him, whatever she wanted to say could wait. With swift steps, he stepped out into the hall, his gun immediately raised to greet any resistance he might encounter. However, the corridor appeared to be very much empty. His frown deepened as he glanced around. Where had they gone? Did they run? His hand clenched tightly around the grip of his gun, as his body already prepared to start yet another pursuit, when suddenly, his eyes fell onto something that made his eyes widen, as his pupils constricted. Blood. There it was. Dark and a deep, deep red. He has seen it before. Miat blood. He has seen it before, when Sheeta... A white-hot flash took his vision for a moment, as a memory tried to surface that only fanned the flames within him. The trail led into a nearby room, and his stomping steps sped up even further as he thundered towards it, intending to follow it to the source and end things here. He lifted his gaze and saw the door. He could feel the wet, slimy ground splash under his feet. They would hear him coming. They would shoot. It didn't matter. He would be quicker. As he walked, he could vaguely hear Sheeta talking behind him the entire time. However, then, suddenly, he understood one thing she was saying. 3.08.5, she yelled out. James didn't hear the context in which she was saying it, but the reason he had suddenly understood her words was because at the very moment she was yelling them, he had been staring right at those same numbers. Room 3.08.5. It was exactly the one he was heading towards right now. Why would she... With a droning, creaking vibration that he felt more than he heard it, the room's door then suddenly began to move right before him. His eyes widened as he sped up his step, trying to make a mad dash towards his destination, but there was no chance. The door closed long before he had reached it, only leaving it for him to slam against it with all of his momentum. As that didn't work, he lifted his arm and hammered it into the wall with all of its enhanced mechanical might, causing the metal to bang like a massive drum as his fist as well as the butt of his weapon crashed against it. However, the door didn't budge. Of course it didn't. They had tried everything to get these things open earlier, and nothing had worked. No way he would think of something new now. He needed a Veselon! It came out of his mouth in a hoarse exhale that barely carried any voice as he realized what must have happened. His fists and teeth all clenched in fury as he looked up at the ceiling, yelling into the room, "A Veselon! Open this damn door! Right now!" There was, of course, no reaction. Another bout of rage coming up from within, he slammed his fist into the door one more time, to the same result as before. Then, he slashed against it for a moment, using that same fist to support himself against the sturdy door. As he stood there, with his cry still not being heard, his eyes slid to the side for a moment, and he remembered his earlier maneuver. The doors may not have been budging, but the walls. Fired up once again, he took a step away from the door and raised his weapon up. It may not have been likely that he would hit someone within the room while shooting blindly, but it was better than nothing. Therefore, he took aim at the wall, only to then have his hand holding the weapon firmly pushed down. His gaze snapping to the side, he saw that Athena had returned, once again trying to stop him. He really wished she didn't. Luckily, his arm was strong and flexible enough to quite handily resist her pushing, meaning he could still take the shot even as she tried to push it down. All he had to do was aim and... James froze, as he lifted his gaze again to look down the sights of his weapon. Just as he had intended, it was aiming right at a Miette. However, this was not the feline he was gunning for. His finger instantaneously slipped away from the trigger, as he realized Sheeta had positioned herself right in front of his barrel, standing between it and the wall. Her yellow eyes stared right at him, as both her ears and tail were raised up high in alert. For a moment, his gaze twitched down to her hand, as she was clearly holding something. And what he saw made his eyes open in sudden understanding. It was his own phone. The brush passed him, the talking, the yelled out room number, a Veselon. It all came crashing in at once, and although he saw the how now, his riled up brain was fighting a desperate struggle with itself to try and understand the why. Why had she stopped him? Those people, they had heard... Before he could finish the thought, there was suddenly a third body in the mix, as firm arms wrapped around James while someone pushed himself in front of his body. James glanced down to look at his face. Amir had his eyes squeezed shut, as his arms held him tightly in a strong embrace. The fire inside of him flickered for a moment, as James saw that face, and slowly his eyes began to wander. Only now did he see how worried Sheeta's stern gaze looked as she stood in front of him. Only now did he feel Athena slightly shake as she held onto his unyielding mechanical arm that still gripped onto a gun, as if it was a lifeline in the deepest cave, even if his finger was no longer on the trigger. And, slowly but surely, he allowed her to press it down. His grip loosened to the point that the gun clattered to the ground, as his arm was about halfway in its descent. And before he knew it, James felt the first streak of hot liquid flood down his cheek, as all the emotions that had previously been burned away by his wrath suddenly came rushing back to him, all at once.